love writing, and sometimes the feeling is mutual. I'd always been a writer since I first discovered the feeling it gave me, that act of creation. I can even recall the first time that concept was rooted in my brain. I was a child of a tender age and had heard the poem, Fuzzy Wuzzy was a bear, Fuzzy Wuzzy had no hair, Fuzzy Wuzzy wasn't fuzzy wuzzy. Well, my child mind could not recall the ending of that poem, so I wrote one of my own. Fuzzy Wuzzy was a bear, Fuzzy Wuzzy had no hair, so I gave him a wig to wear. Now, I realize as an adult that my creation of that last line wasn't going to change the orbit of the Earth, but what was more important was the feeling it gave me. I had completed a piece of writing using my own creativity, and I had this surge of creative hubris. I recognized that writing meant that I could make things up. I could create anything I wanted to create. And because it was made up, it didn't have to be the truth, which is why I suppose I have such an affinity for writing fiction. Fiction writing is like playing God. You can create a whole human being and then smite him. And more to the point, I discovered along the way the incredible cathartic value of that. I could fictionalize the people who crossed my path, and if they'd wronged me, I could get my revenge on the page. But writing books is not something you do just for fun. You do it because you're compelled to do it. You're drawn to it like it has some inexplicable gravitational field. One of the inherent problems with being a writer is it's so solitary. It was way different than my days in rock bands. I had 2 bands for about 7 years, and when you're performing on stage, you get immediate feedback, you get applause. When I finish a chapter of a book I'm writing, I've learned that there is no applause. It has to be good enough that you applaud yourself. And sometimes, honestly, it isn't enough. So you have to be careful not to sink too far into the morass of self-pity. I once got so frustrated with the degree of commitment it takes to keep writing that in a petulant fugue I said, "I'm not writing anymore. This is too hard. It's never appreciated." And I stopped writing. A week later, I was more miserable than I had been before. I realized I could not be content or feel any degree of personal satisfaction unless I was writing. I had no choice but to honor the thing I felt I was meant to be doing, whether it paid the bills or not. That's why I advise writers to always have another sufficient source of income. It's really difficult to make a living as a writer. Then as you immerse yourself in the writing vocation, you come up against another obstacle, one of many. You realize that ultimately you have to make another choice. It seems, though that choice is unfortunate, it is more often than not true. You have to choose between writing what you love to write and in just the way you want to write it on the one hand, or writing what is commercially viable. Every now and then a writer will have both those things at once, but it's not as often as you might think. It seems to be more often because we hear about the successful writers who have contracts with major publishing houses. We don't hear about the ones who don't get that contract, even though they might be worthy of one. I'll cover that more in detail later. But if you're getting into the writing business, you must be realistic about certain truths, of which that is one. Being a great writer will not guarantee you a contract. The general opinion from agents is that if you're good and you keep trying long enough, you will be discovered. But there are some underpinnings of that you should be aware of. So pressing on, continuing to submit your work means a commitment to spending money. You must send out your manuscript over and over again, sometimes 100 or more times. We all know the price of an ink cartridge. Add to that the cost of the paper and the mailing and postage, and you're looking at $40 easily, and that's for one manuscript, one time. So send that out 100 times and you're looking at $4,000. That's not counting whatever you might spend on supplies, a computer, a printer, etc. The publishing industry, in my humble opinion, is a little behind the times in that regard. I find it utterly archaic to expect writers to descend into poverty just to have their work looked at. Some of them are catching up, as in the ones who accept email queries, but I think the whole industry ought to allow electronic submissions of the entire manuscript. I wrote my first full-length novel in 1989. Wow. 21 years. Time flies when you're killing your enemies on the page. I'd spent my early years writing poetry and short stories, essays, songs, and as I matured, I read voluminously in different genres. I also discovered my sexual orientation. Sitting before you is a card-carrying lesbian, though I dislike that moniker. No matter. So after a while, I developed this need to read about people like me. And we all do that. We read to either entertain ourselves, escape into a fictional world, or to feel some kind of kindredness with others, a sense of belonging. In my case, what started me on this journey was the latter. Back then, I began to read lesbian fiction and was sorely disappointed. The characters in those books were all so fucked up. I mean, they were drug addicts, alcoholics, thieves, ethically challenged, or just mentally ill. And I knew this was not me, my life, nor the lives of anyone I knew who was gay. I was offended by those depictions. Just so dissatisfied with the stories and the characters that populated those books. So I resolved to write a book that I would want to read. The first one was As You Were, and the second was Armchair Detective, both of which have been rewritten about 217 times. I've done that with all my work, and this was because I was learning more and more about the craft, and I would go back and apply all of what I'd learned to those manuscripts until I was satisfied that they were the best that they could be. Anyway, I also have 2 mainstream books with not a single gay character in them. I did that on purpose too, when I realized that I wanted to know if after all these years I could write about straight people. I discovered something very important. People are people. Whether gay or straight, they all have the same types of desires and goals and shortcomings and dramas in their lives. That was a crucial bit of information. Writing good novels is about the people as much as the plot. Another thing that validated this discovery was how popular my lesbian books were with straight people. That was surprising. One of my best friends, Tanya, is straight and she absolutely adores them. Her favorite is Armchair Detective, and she was the one who convinced me to write a sequel to that book. That's called, also known as DNA. And this was only because she said she was so in love with those characters. That was probably the highest compliment she could have paid me. I mean, a straight woman in love with my gay characters. So, people are people. She did mention that at first she was nervous to read it because what did she know about lesbians and their relationships? But then she said that it was the same as straight relationships. The only difference was the lack of a male gender. So don't limit yourselves as writers. When you get to a place where you can write with confidence, write something that will really give you stretch marks. Like, for me, that was my first mainstream book, Achilles' Fortune. That book was trial by fire for me. It turned out to be a multi-genre work. It had elements of police procedure and law and psychology, medical personnel and issues. The 2 main characters were paramedics. It had a psychic, and it also was about a serial killer. I had to juggle something like 32 characters in that book, and I had to fashion a plot that would intertwine them all leave plenty of red herrings and still make sense of the relationships that were being challenged within the story. Finishing that book, Achilles' Fortune, was like graduating from some writer's college. I had so much more confidence in my ability to write well. It was one of the best decisions I think I've ever made. And it gave me the confidence to write the second mainstream novel, Baggage, which was of an entirely different genre, but just as complicated in its own way. To that end, I'll share some things I've learned along the way, and maybe it will save you all some time. These are my writing words of wisdom. I was recently asked again for words of wisdom regarding being a writer and seeking publication, so I thought I would just blog it, and I did. Mainly what I talked about was, well, I have some strong opinions about writing and publishing, and that springs from my experience over 20 or 25 years of pursuing it, and numerous blogs, articles, essays, and having written and rewritten 15 books. 16 now. I just sent a manuscript in today for my memoir. Add to this also webmastering, book cover design, typography, editing, and publishing. I wanted to learn all the aspects of completing a book. My most commonly offered caveat is this: don't fall in love with your words, fall in love with your craft. That's when you'll begin that's when you'll begin the process of being a quality writer. And this subject is voluminous, and I can't do it justice in a soundbite, but the other words of wisdom I will offer are these. The competition to be a published writer is fierce. The dream of getting published has been overly romanticized in the media, so that many beginning writers think not only that writing is easy, but that they have a good chance of getting a contract from a major house. The odds are realistically 1 in a million, maybe worse than that. We hear about the success stories, not the ones who spend their lives toiling for that dream to the exclusion of everything else, only to wind up poor, alone, lacking in social skills, and profoundly jaded that life has passed them by. There are so many unpublished writers who pursue this dream, and publishers and agents have had to crack down on the criteria to even look at a work sent. And it's very expensive for the writer to submit manuscripts, as I mentioned, and it's time consuming, as we have to do this repeatedly if we ever hope to get traditionally published. You have to pour lots of money into the endeavor over a period of many years sometimes, and more often than not, this investment does not return. Often then, self-publishing is the only option if a writer wants to get her work out there. There's little point in spending your entire life hoping while your words stay in a drawer. I believe as writers, we are meant to honor that talent and share it. Otherwise, what's the point of having it? Fortunately, we live in an era where technology allows us some autonomy and some tools to make this happen. So do whatever you have to do to get your work out there. If it's good, it might eventually get noticed and picked up by a major house or an agent, and that frequently has more to do with who you know than how much you submit your work. So cultivate connections. And also try to go small or medium press. If you get a contract from one of them, you can use those books to woo the larger fish. Additionally, a writer who aspires to be published traditionally needs to make sure she has a dependable source of income other than writing, and she needs to have other things and people in her life that bring her joy and satisfaction. This makes the journey pleasing rather than a chore. And anyway, without an active and varied social life, you run out of things to write about. You must feed the well and meet people and go to events and have new experiences in order to keep your writing vibrant. But back to publishing. Changes are desperately needed in the publishing industry. Old school is just not working in our modern society. Publishers should be more open to self-published submissions. There's still, however, a haughtiness and an arrogance among the industry insiders, and this does nothing to advance the cause of bringing great writing to the reading public. The process has been politicized by the bottom line. Also, while there's a pretension in the publishing community, this is also true of the writing community, which is that if you self-publish, you must not be a good writer. This is not always accurate, though admittedly there are writers who self-publish but have not mastered their craft in any way. Still, there are many quality writers who self-publish, and they're among all the other writers who strive to see their work in print and available to the reading consumer. You might have to dig a little, but they can be found, and you can be among them if you really want to share your work. You have to ask yourself what's more important, the prestige of major house publication or honoring the talent and sharing it. I take a more humanistic view of all this, as you might guess by now. I think it's more important to get the work out there than cling to it against overwhelming odds. Writers usually are good at living inside their own fiction. This is fine on the page, but it doesn't work so well in the real world. If I had a 1 in a million chance of winning $1 million playing roulette and a 1 in 10 chance of winning $100 the same way, I'm more likely to put my chips on the 1 in 10. That's what it is to self-publish. The work is being made available to readers, and that's one reason I write. I write first for me and second for the readers. If no one knows about it and no one can read it, then what have you accomplished? If it's not at least partly about the readers, then the process of writing is just a glorified form of masturbation. Self-publishing doesn't mean I can't submit manuscripts. Anyway, I suspect it's risky to submit one that's already been self-published, and this is an area I need to learn more about. Problem is, it's a new issue. The technological age is overlapping with the traditional one, and we're in transition in that regard. Honestly, I haven't made much of an effort to pitch my books since I started learning the process from start to finish. I just kept using my books as guinea pigs to learn how it's all done, and by the time I had edited, re-edited, handed them around to various proofreaders, designed the typography and the covers, well, it just seemed a shame not to go ahead and publish them so they'd be listed on Amazon, and so that's what I did.